All right, let's dive in. We're stepping back in time to the kingdom of Judah, a nation, just living on a knife's edge. You've got the Babylonian Empire, this absolute superpower, breathing down their necks. It's a time of just intense fear, a ton of political maneuvering, and this really desperate search for hope. And smack in the middle of it all, one prophet's voice is about to cut through all that noise with a terrifying truth.
And that really gets us to the central question for this whole explainer. What happens when the people in charge, the leaders you trust, promise you a false peace? This is the exact tension Jeremiah is up against. A clash between these really comfortable lies and a just, brutally harsh truth. Okay, let's get into it. So, right out of the gate, we're thrown into this major conflict, a real battle of messages. See, Jeremiah is hearing one thing from God, but all the other prophets in Jerusalem, well, they're preaching something completely different. So, picture this. This was the message that was just echoing through the streets of Jerusalem, and it must have sounded like the sweetest music to a terrified people. In verse 13, Jeremiah actually repeats what these other prophets are saying. I mean, can you imagine the relief of hearing your leaders, your spiritual guides, say, don't worry about a thing. There's going to be no war, no famine. God has guaranteed our peace right here, right now. It was, without a doubt, the ultimate feel-good prophecy. And this, right here, just lays it all out so clearly. It's a collision of two totally different realities. On one side, you have the promise of assured peace, this comforting blanket of security. And on the other, God's brutal honesty coming through Jeremiah's sword and famine. It's just a head-on crash between a lie that feels good and a truth that is absolutely devastating. So what does God think about all this? Well, in verse 14, he does not pull any punches. He flat out says these prophets are liars, that they're speaking in his name, but he never sent them. He calls their messages a false vision, basically something that came from their own heads, from the deceit of their heart, maybe to stay popular or to tell the king what he wanted to hear.
A lie of this magnitude, a deception this deep, it just can't be left to stand. The consequences were, well, they were inevitable, and they were going to be severe. And as we're about to see, God's justice would start with the very people who were peddling that lie in the first place.
And boom, here it is in verse 15. This is the kicker. The very prophets who promised no sword, no famine, would be the first ones to be consumed by sword and famine. Talk about some terrifying irony, right? The safety they promised everyone else was a safety they themselves would never, ever see. And what about the people who bought into this lie, who clung to this false hope? Well, for them, the result is an absolute nightmare scenario, a complete breakdown of society. The death toll from the war and the starvation would be so massive, so completely overwhelming, that even the most basic human dignity, a proper burial, would become an impossible luxury. Their bodies would just be left in the streets, a horrifying monument to a nation's shattered hope. And listen, this wasn't just some abstract theological debate. History would prove Jeremiah's warnings to be tragically, horribly correct. First, in 605 BC, Babylonian influence starts to creep in. Then, the first real blow in 597 BC with the first deportation from Jerusalem. And then, the final catastrophic event in 586 BC, when they returned, laid siege to the city, and burned the temple to the ground. The false prophets' promises of peace were literally consumed in the flames of their conquered city. But this story isn't just about being right. It's about the absolutely crushing weight of that truth. The narrative shifts now, and we get to see the immense personal toll of this catastrophe through the eyes of the one man who saw it all coming, Jeremiah. And this is where things get really fascinating in verse 17. God actually tells Jeremiah to grieve, to weep publicly. His sorrow is meant to be a kind of prophetic statement. And that phrase, virgin daughter of my people, it's this beautiful, tragic metaphor for Jerusalem. A city that was once seen as pure and protected by God, now violated, broken by a great breach. So Jeremiah becomes our tour guide through this devastation, painting this panoramic, heartbreaking picture. In verse 18, he tells us to look out over the fields, places that were once fertile and full of life. Now, they're just a grim harvest of war, the bodies of the slain, victims of the sword. And it's no better inside the city walls. The horror just continues. He enters the city and sees people who are sick and dying from famine, the slow, agonizing result of the siege. From the countryside to the city streets, there is just no escape. The entire nation is completely undone.
So after seeing all of this, I mean, what do you even do? Jeremiah's grief just boils over into this raw, brutally honest confrontation with God. He becomes the voice for his suffering people, asking the questions that everybody else must have been thinking. And this question right here in verse 19, man, it just cuts right to the heart of it all. It's this cry of pure anguish and confusion. He's basically asking, God, have you completely abandoned us? Have you come to hate us? We were looking for peace, but all we got was trouble. We were looking for a time of healing, and instead we got terror.
But here's the thing. His lament doesn't just stop there in despair. It pivots to a place of profound honesty, of real humility. In verse 20, we get this national confession. It's a collective acknowledgement of their part in the disaster, and not just their own sins, but the sins of their fathers, this generational debt that had finally come due.
And this is the pivot. It's absolutely brilliant. In verse 21, Jeremiah makes it crystal clear they aren't pleading because they think they're righteous. They know they're not. The plea is for God to act for the sake of his own reputation. He says, don't disgrace your glorious throne. Remember your covenant with us. It's an appeal to God's character. So this final part of the chapter pivots from that raw confession to a really powerful affirmation of who God is and what that means even when you're standing in the middle of total collapse. So Jeremiah throws out this killer rhetorical question. He's basically dismissing all the false hopes they might have had. Can the idols of other nations bring life-giving rain? Can making a deal with a superpower like Egypt or even Babylon actually save you? The answer, he implies, is a huge no. They're just powerless vanities. And that all leads to this final incredible declaration in verse 22. After confronting a false peace, witnessing an awful judgment, and pouring out his grief, this is where Jeremiah lands. Only God is sovereign. Only God is actually in control of creation itself. And so, in the face of total ruin, the only logical, the only faithful response left is to wait on him. What a profound, powerful place to land when literally everything else has fallen apart.